The drone feed showed 3 vehicles moving through the Kandahar Valley at exactly the speed of men who knew they weren't being watched. Staff Sergeant Renata Voss watched the screen for 11 seconds before she said anything. Then she said, "They're going to the school." Nobody in the operations tent responded immediately. That was the thing about Voss that the men of 3rd Ranger Battalion had never quite learned to account for. Not her accuracy, not her range, but the timing. She always spoke before anyone else had finished processing what they were seeing, and she was almost always right. And somehow that made it worse instead of better. They're heading to the checkpoint. That was Sergeant First Class Dale Ruiz, the team's senior NCO, correcting her without looking away from his own screen. 14 years in service, 2 combat deployments before this one. He had the particular confidence of a man who had been wrong before, but never in front of people who remembered. Voss didn't argue. She just kept watching the feed. 4 minutes later, the vehicles turned south, toward the school. She had come to the team the way most attachments came, with paperwork and a brief, and the kind of careful, bureaucratic language that told experienced operators nothing useful. Sharpshooter qualification, advanced reconnaissance, multiple commendations. The file read clean and professional and said almost nothing about the actual human being it described. What the file didn't say was that Renata Voss had grown up in the boreal forests of northern Ontario, the youngest of 4 children raised by a father who trapped and hunted and spent his winters moving through country that punished inattention the way combat did, absolutely and without appeal. What the file didn't say was that she had been reading terrain since she was 7 years old, that she could track a mule deer through a week-old snowfield, that her father had taught her to see landscape as a living system rather than a static backdrop. The Army had given her a rifle and a scope and a formal vocabulary for things she had known in her body since childhood. She was 31 years old. She had the quiet watchfulness of someone who spent most of her time observing, and the particular stillness of a person who had learned early that speaking first rarely served you well. None of this was in the file. What Ruiz saw when she arrived was a woman, medium height, unremarkable in the way that some people are unremarkable until they're suddenly not. What he saw was someone who moved carefully through the operations tent and found the chair, with the best sightline, to the primary screen before anyone else had noticed that mattered. What he saw was someone who didn't introduce herself to the room, but waited until individuals approached her, and then answered their questions with the minimum necessary information. And nothing else. He had decided within 20 minutes that she was going to be a problem. Not incompetent. He could manage incompetent. He'd managed incompetent a dozen times, and the solution was always the same. Put them somewhere they couldn't hurt anyone and wait for the rotation to end. This was something different. This was the kind of quiet that makes other people feel loud. "She's a desk posting," he told Captain Holloway that first evening, over the particular terrible coffee that forward operating bases produced with a consistency that rivaled manufacturing. 2 years pushing paper at Bagram before this. Whatever she was before that, she isn't anymore. Holloway looked at him. He was 38 years old and had learned, over the course of 14 years of command, to take Ruiz's assessments seriously and his judgments with exactly 1 measured grain of salt. "Her evaluations are exceptional. Evaluations are paper. So is the insurgent activity report sitting on my desk that says we have an IED network operating in this valley that nobody can find because nobody can get eyes on the supply routes." Holloway set down his cup. "She's here. She's qualified. We use her." Ruiz said nothing. He had, as it happened, nothing useful to say. The mission briefing happened the following morning in the gray early light before the heat settled in. Holloway laid out what they knew. A network of supply routes running through the valley's northern ridgeline, ammunition and materials, moving to at least 3 active cells. A pattern of movement that had so far defeated 4 attempts at interdiction because whoever was running the logistics was careful and patient and very good at using terrain. There were 7 operators in the room. Voss sat at the back. She asked one question, at the end after everyone else had finished. She asked it without raising her hand, just spoke into a brief silence. "What's the vegetation line on the northern ridge?" Holloway looked at his notes. "Pine to about 2,200 meters. Above that, scrub and rock. Is there a water source in the middle section? Around the saddle? There might be a seasonal creek. Why?" Voss looked at the topographic map for a long moment. "That's where they're caching, not at the endpoints. In the middle, near water, where the resupply teams can move at night using the creek bed as a path, and the vegetation provides overhead cover from drones. She paused. They've been doing it for probably 6 months. The reason we can't find the pattern is we've been watching the wrong end of the movement. The room was quiet. Monroe, the team's designated marksman, laughed once. It wasn't an entirely friendly sound. She's been here 12 hours and she's telling us how to run the valley. I'm telling you where the cache is, Voss said. She wasn't looking at Monroe. She was still looking at the map. Whether you go check is your business. They went and checked. The cache was exactly where Voss had said it would be. A depression in the creek bed lined with stacked ammunition cases and wrapped in camouflage netting that had been in place long enough to have pine needles sifted into the folds. 3 weeks of supplies, minimum, possibly more. Ruiz stood in the creek bed looking at what they'd found and said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, to nobody in particular, desk posting. They extracted without contact, secured the site, and called in the find. The intelligence debrief lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, the Battalion S2 had revised their understanding of the Valley's logistics network so completely that the previous 6 months of analysis effectively had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Holloway found Voss after the debrief, cleaning her rifle in the shade of the motor pool, moving through the process with the kind of methodical attention that indicated either very good training or very long habit. Probably both. How did you know? He asked. Water and shelter. She ran a patch through the barrel without looking up. In any cold weather environment, people cache near water when they can. It's not tactics, it's just physics. You're moving weight at night over rough ground. You want a landmark you can find in the dark, and you want to be able to refill what you're carrying. The creek is obvious once you're looking for it. She paused. Nobody was looking for it because everyone was focused on the endpoints. Beginning and end, not the middle. Holloway considered that. Ruse thinks you've been underemployed. Ruse thinks I've been overpositioned. There was no bitterness in it, just precision. He's not entirely wrong. But that's not the problem I'm here to solve. What problem are you here to solve? Voss set the barrel section down and looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. The one you called me in for, the IED network. She picked up the next component. I need 3 days on the northern ridge with a spotter I choose and no radio traffic except emergency calls. If there's a pattern to the network's movement, I'll find it. Holloway said yes. He told Ruiz afterward. Ruiz was quiet for almost a full minute. Then, she wants to pick her own spotter. Yes, she picked Monroe. Holloway had, in fact, been surprised by that. She did. Monroe has been making her life difficult since she arrived. I know. Ruiz looked at the wall for a moment. Either that's very smart or it's going to be a disaster. That, Holloway said, is also approximately what I think. Monroe found out he'd been requested by way of Ruiz, which meant he found out flatly and without editorial comment, and was therefore unable to gauge how he was supposed to feel about it. He went to find Voss. She was studying maps. She had been studying maps in various configurations since her arrival, and Monroe had privately decided this was performative. The kind of thing someone did to look diligent, rather than because they were actually getting anything out of it. You asked for me, he said. I did. Why? Voss looked up. Because you have the best eyes in the team, and you know this valley better than anyone else here. I need someone who can confirm what I'm seeing at range, because the shots I'm going to need to make don't leave room for a wrong call on wind or distance. She held his gaze. I don't care whether you like me. I care whether you can do the job. Monroe said nothing for a long moment. Then what shots? I don't know yet. That's what the 3 days are for. The ridge was everything the topographic map had suggested, and several things it hadn't. Cold at night in a way that got into joints. Wind patterns that shifted with the thermals in ways that a map couldn't capture, that you had to read in real time. Watching dust and grass and the small movements of scrub brush and committing the pattern to memory so that a shift at the wrong moment didn't ruin a calculation you'd spent 20 minutes making. Voss moved through the first day without making a single shot. She watched. She built a picture of the valley below, the routes people used, the routes people avoided, the places where activity clustered, and the places that stayed still. She watched with the particular quality of attention that most people lose before adulthood, the attention that treats everything as potentially significant and nothing as background noise. Monroe watched her watch. He kept his comments to himself, which was an exercise in discipline that cost him something. On the second day, she said, Northwest quadrant, There's a shepherd who isn't shepherding. Monroe looked. There was, in fact, a man with a small flock moving along a path that made no agricultural sense. Too rocky, no good grazing, the wrong direction for the time of day. Could just be he stops at the same 2 points yesterday. Same times, approximately. Watches the valley for about 4 minutes, then moves. Voss hadn't lowered her scope. He's a scout, that's a civilian. He's a man doing reconnaissance work for an IED network. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She paused. I'm not going to shoot him. I'm going to watch where he watches and figure out who he's watching for. Monroe was quiet. She was right again. The shepherd's 2 stopping points corresponded, when plotted on the map that evening, to sightlines covering the 2 most likely approach routes into the valley's central section. Whoever was using him as a lookout had positioned him with real tactical thought. They've been doing this for a long time, Monroe said. Months, minimum. Probably longer. Voss marked the map, and they're good. Which means there's someone running this who has training, not just experience.
How do you deal with the difference?
Experience teaches you what works. Training teaches you why it works. She set down the pencil. Experience adapts to what's in front of it. Training builds systems. This is a system. On the 3rd day, she found the coordinator. He was positioned on a sub-ridge below their own, in a rocky outcrop that provided cover from the valley floor but not from above, a miscalculation that suggested he had never considered the possibility of someone being positioned higher than he was. He had communications equipment. He had, from what Voss could read at distance, a schedule. Range, she asked Monroe, 1,100 meters. Wind from the east, variable 5 to 12. I know. She was already reading it, the grass below, the dust on the track, the way the scrub moved at intervals. He's going to make a call in about 6 minutes. I need command authorization before he does. Monroe had the radio. He made the call. The authorization came back in 3 minutes. He's looking at his watch, Monroe said. I know. Voss settled. Her breathing slowed to the particular rhythm that was less like calm and more like the deliberate replacement of one state with another. The practice setting aside of everything except the problem in front of her. Wind is dropping? Give me a number in 30 seconds. 8. From the east. Consistent. Consistent is good. She fired once. The coordinator's communications equipment went silent. The shot had been placed with the kind of precision that left no ambiguity about whether it had been intentional. Monroe lowered his scope and looked at her. That was 1,100 meters, he said, with a variable crosswind. 8, she said. It settled. He looked at her for another moment. Then he keyed the radio and made the confirmation call, and the valley below began its process of reorganizing around the absence of whoever had just been removed from it. And Voss began the methodical task of documenting everything she had observed over 3 days in the kind of detailed notes that would matter later, in the intelligence debriefs, when people tried to understand how the network had actually worked. Monroe helped her pack. He did it without being asked and without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. The debrief lasted most of a day. The intelligence coming out of Voss's 3 days on the ridge was, in the assessment of the Battalion S2, the most comprehensive, single-source picture of the valley's insurgent logistics that they had produced in 8 months of operations. The coordinator she had identified and neutralized turned out to be a former signals officer from a regional military force, trained, as she had suspected, rather than merely experienced. Ruiz attended the debrief. He sat through it without speaking, which was unusual for him. Afterward, he found Voss in the motor pool. She was again cleaning her rifle. He stood for a moment watching this and then said, "How long have you been doing this?" Shooting, reading terrain like that, knowing where to look. She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to most things. I don't remember not doing it. My father taught me. We hunted. You learn to read a landscape or you go home empty, and in our country going home empty in winter is a problem. Northern Ontario, Ruiz said. She looked up, slightly surprised. I read your file, he said, after the creek. I should have read it more carefully the first time. He paused. The desk posting. That was voluntary, she said. My mother was sick. I needed to be reachable. She turned the bolt in her hands. She died. I came back. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. I was wrong about you. It was not a man who said things like that easily, and Voss seemed to understand this because she didn't make it easy for him by deflecting. She just nodded. I know, she said, but it didn't change what I could see. The operation that followed was the one that tested her in ways the ridge hadn't. The intelligence from the debrief had identified a second coordinator, a logistics specialist, who had been running the network's supply chain from a village on the valley's eastern edge. The village was occupied. Civilians, families, a market that operated 3 days a week. The coordinator moved through it with the particular immunity of someone who understood that military forces would not take risks with civilian infrastructure that he was willing to take himself. The extraction team went in at night. Voss was on a hilltop 2 kilometers east, with Monroe spotting, watching the village through a scope, and tracking 5 separate individuals whose movement patterns had been flagged in the intelligence brief as potentially significant. The team hit contact 12 minutes into the operation. It was not ambush. It was worse than ambush, because an ambush has a defined point of origin. This was a rolling engagement with multiple positions that had been established over several days and were mutually supporting in ways that made direct assault nearly impossible. The team was pinned, working with the geometry of cover that had been deliberately designed to be inadequate. Voss heard the contact over the radio. She was already scanning. "Northwest building," she said. "Second floor, the window with the broken shutter. Someone's been watching from there since before the team went in." Monroe reoriented. "I see him. 1,400 meters, 1380. The building is on a slight rise." She was reading angles that Monroe was still calculating. "He's a spotter for the rooftop position on the building south of the market. They're coordinating. How do you?" "He keeps looking south, not at the team." "South. He's relaying positions." She keyed her radio. "Actual, this is Voss. You have a coordinated observation network, not a fixed ambush. The positions are being directed from a spotter in the northwest building, second floor. If you can suppress the southwest approach, the rooftop position loses its direction and the engagement should break down." There was a pause on the radio. Then Holloway's voice, tight with the particular tension of a man making decisions under fire. "Can you take the spotter?" "I can take the spotter. But the rooftop position will need to be addressed from the ground within about 40 seconds after that, or they'll relocate. Take the shot." Monroe gave her the final number. She had already made most of the calculation. The shot went to the second floor of the northwest building. 40 seconds later on the ground, the team suppressed the southwest approach. The rooftop position relocated, which meant they moved, which meant they were visible for approximately 8 seconds as they crossed a gap between 2 buildings. Voss took that shot too. The engagement ended in the way engagements end when the coordination holding them together is removed. Not dramatically, but structurally, like a wall from which 2 load-bearing elements have been pulled. The remaining positions, no longer mutually supporting, became individually manageable. The team extracted with the logistics coordinator in custody and 2 wounded, neither critical. Monroe sat back from his scope and looked at his hands for a moment. 2 shots, he said. 1,400 meters in the dark with a moving target secondary, 1380 and 1290. That's not? He stopped. "How long did you have on the second one?" "About 7 seconds. The gap between the buildings is wider than it looks from here." Monroe was quiet for a long time. "Then, what you said before the mission, that you need a spotter who can do the job, and you don't care whether they like you." He looked at her. "I owe you an apology. For the past 2 weeks, you were doing what you thought was right for your team." Voss was already documenting, writing in the small, precise script she used for field notes. "That's not something to apologize for. I was wrong. You were. But you confirmed what I needed you to confirm tonight when it mattered. That's what spotters do." She looked up. "You were good, Monroe. I couldn't have made the second shot without your call on the wind shift." Monroe looked at her for a moment, and then he did something that surprised both of them. Or at least, that's how it appeared from the outside. He laughed. A real laugh, brief and slightly relieved, like a man who had been holding something difficult and had just been allowed to set it down. The after-action review was thorough, in the way that reviews become thorough when something has gone better than expected, and the people running them want to understand why, before the understanding evaporates. Holloway went through it, item by item. When he reached the observation network analysis, the call Voss had made from 2 kilometers away, in the dark, about the coordination structure of an engagement she was watching through a scope, he stopped and looked at her. "Walk me through it," he said. "How did you know the northwest building was a spotter and not just an armed occupant?" Voss considered how to explain something she had done intuitively and then rationally confirmed in approximately 4 seconds. His head movement. He wasn't tracking the team. The team was moving north to the target building, and he was looking south. If you're watching a firefight, you look at the firefight. If you're directing one, you look at your reference point. She paused. Also, the building put him at exactly the right elevation to observe the rooftop position without being observed by anyone at ground level. Whoever chose it knew what they were doing. You made that assessment from 2 kilometers at night. The scope has good light amplification. Ruiz said, from the side of the room, that's not what he's asking. Voss looked at him. He's asking how you knew to look for it, Ruiz said. The rest of us were focused on the contact points, the positions where the team was taking fire. You looked at where nobody was shooting from. That's where the information is, Voss said. The people shooting are showing you what they know. The people not shooting are showing you how they know it. She looked around the room. In any coordinated engagement, there's an element that doesn't fire. The observation network, the communications. Find that, and the rest of the engagement becomes legible. The room was quiet. My father used to say that when you're hunting, she said, into the quiet, the thing that tells you where the animal is isn't the animal. It's everything around the animal that's reacting to it. The birds, the way the other deer move, the patterns that are broken by a presence you can't see yet. She stopped. I've been doing this a long time. It becomes reflexive. Holloway made a note. Where did you train? Mostly outdoors, she said. Ontario. A few 100 kilometers of lake country and not much else. What Holloway wrote in his assessment, the document that would eventually move up through channels and arrive on desks that Voss didn't know existed and wouldn't have thought about if she had, was this. Demonstrated capacity for real-time tactical analysis under fire that exceeds conventional sharpshooter function. Recommend expanded operational role pending psychological evaluation and command review. What he said to Ruiz, in the briefer and more honest language of 2 men who had been working together long enough to speak plainly, was, she's the best thing that's happened to this team in 2 years, and we spent the first week treating her like a filing error. Ruiz, who had the particular dignity of a man who genuinely respected the truth even when it cost him, said, yes, we did. What changed your mind? The creek or the ridge? The creek, Ruiz said. The ridge confirmed my mind was watching her in the operations tent the morning after the creek find. She didn't come in and take credit for it. She just went back to the maps. He was quiet for a moment. People who are performing competence need the audience. People who actually have it move on to the next problem. Holloway nodded. We keep her, Ruiz said. It wasn't a question. We keep her. There was a conversation later that didn't happen in any official record. Voss was on the ridge again. Not for a mission, just to watch, which was something she did with the same routine naturalness that other people applied to morning coffee. And Monroe came up to find her. He sat down a few feet away and looked at the valley for a while. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, the shot on the rooftop, the second one, 7-second window. He looked at her. Were you sure? She was quiet for a long time. No, she said, but you took it. The team needed it taken. And I had done the math, and the math said I could make it, and I trusted the math. She looked at the valley. There's a difference between certainty and confidence. I'm never certain. I've been certain twice in my life, and both times I was wrong about something small that turned out to matter. So I stopped trying to be certain. She paused. Confidence is different. Confidence is knowing you've done the preparation and trusting that the preparation is adequate. I was confident. Monroe thought about that. How do you learn the difference? You get it wrong a few times, she said. In situations where getting it wrong has consequences. And you figure out what the difference feels like from the inside. That sounds like a hard way to learn. It is, she said, but it's the only one that sticks. They sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have moved past the point where silence is uncomfortable, watching the valley in the late afternoon light. The terrain below them was the same terrain it had always been. Ridgelines, creek beds, routes that favored the patient over the fast. But it looked different now to Monroe than it had 2 weeks ago. He wasn't sure if that was because of what he'd seen or because of who he'd watched seeing it. Maybe both. Probably both. Your father, he said. Did he know you were going to end up doing this? Voss almost smiled. It was the closest to a smile she came, usually. A slight alteration at the corners of her mouth, the thing that happened to her face when she was genuinely, if quietly, amused. He said I was going to end up somewhere that needed people who could read what they were looking at. He didn't know where. He said the where would figure itself out. Smart man, he was. He died before I shipped out the first time. didn't see any of it. She was quiet for a moment, but he taught me everything that made it possible. So in a way, he sees it every time. Monroe didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say, and he had recently learned, or perhaps relearned, the value of not saying things that weren't useful. The valley went golden in the fading light. Somewhere below, the patterns Voss had been watching for 3 weeks continued their patient movement through terrain that gave nothing away to the inattentive and told everything to anyone willing to sit still and look. Monroe had finally understood not a lucky guesser or a paper qualification or a bureaucratic inconvenience. She was what happened when a particular kind of mind was given a particular kind of training and then put somewhere that needed exactly that combination. She was someone who saw the valley as a system rather than a backdrop, who read absence as carefully as presence, who had learned in a cold northern forest that the world communicated constantly and without favor to anyone who understood how to listen. He thought about what Ruiz had said. People who actually have it move on to the next problem. She was already scanning the northern ridge. The next problem, whatever it was, would not see her coming.